The Long March to the Ballot, the global women's suffrage movement. If democracy is the bedrock of modern civilization, then the right to vote is its most sacred expression. But this right was a battlefield, where women worldwide fought fiercely for inclusion. Welcome to Chronicles, as we unfold the journey of the global women's suffrage movement. The right to vote, often considered the cornerstone of democracy, was for many years an exclusive privilege. The campaign for women's suffrage is a complex tapestry with threads that reach far back into human history, long before hashtags or viral campaigns. Let's explore the origins that catalyzed this movement. Women's right to vote can be traced back to medieval Europe in some instances, but the modern movement is most often linked to the political ferment of 19th century Britain. In 1866, a group of women organized a petition that John Stuart Mill presented to the UK Parliament, demanding the right to vote. This petition, however modest it may seem today, was the spark that ignited the British suffrage movement. Across the Atlantic, the American movement took form in parallel. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, marked the beginning of the women's rights movement in the United States. The convention produced the Declaration of Sentiments, which, among other things, asserted women's right to vote. But the wave of change wasn't confined to the Western world. For instance, the Grand Duchy of Finland became the first territory in the world to not only grant women the right to vote in 1906 but also to run for office. In 1893, New Zealand became the first self-governing country where women won the right to vote. And Australia wasn't far behind, granting federal suffrage in 1902. These movements were fueled by an intellectual underpinning that cannot be ignored. The Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft in Britain, and the feminist journals in the United States, laid the ideological groundwork. These writings challenged deeply ingrained beliefs, questioning the supposed natural inferiority of women and arguing for equality. While the most visible suffragists were often white and middle class, it's crucial to recognize the efforts of working-class women, women of color, and even non-binary individuals. Their stories are often erased or marginalized but are every bit as crucial in the fight for suffrage. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, what began as isolated campaigns had grown into a global push for women's rights. The roots had spread, and the suffrage tree was ready to bear fruit. As the 20th century dawned, the suffrage movement picked up unprecedented momentum. Women weren't asking anymore, they were demanding, marching, and protesting. In the United States, suffragists like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns took inspiration from their British counterparts, organizing grand parades and picketing the White House. The 1913 Women's Suffrage Procession in Washington, D.C., was a landmark event, drawing thousands to the streets, demanding the right to vote. In the UK, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Sylvia and Christabel led the suffragettes, a more militant faction. They adopted the motto, "Deeds, not words," participating in hunger strikes and even arson to gain attention for their cause. Meanwhile, the suffrage cause was becoming increasingly global. From India to China to Latin America, women began asserting their rights. The methods varied, petitions in some countries, protests in others, but the message was the same: women deserved an equal voice. It's vital to remember that this was not a monolithic movement. For instance, in the U.S., African American women like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell played significant roles, often navigating both gender and racial discrimination. Internationally, indigenous women and women of color were more than just footnotes, they were authors of their own destinies. The road wasn't smooth. Anti-suffragist campaigns painted women as emotionally unfit to vote, or too delicate for the rough world of politics. These sentiments were not confined to men, some women also opposed suffrage, viewing it as a challenge to traditional social structures. World War I acted as a catalyst. With men off fighting, women took on roles that were unthinkable just years before. This shifted perceptions, and after the war, many nations, including the United States and Britain, expanded voting rights to women as a nod to their contributions during the conflict. And so, despite the hurdles, despite the naysayers, the suffrage movement marched on, literally and figuratively, turning what was once a whisper into a global shout heard around the world. While names like Susan B. Anthony and Emmeline Pankhurst are well known, countless unsung heroes propelled the suffrage movement forward, leaving indelible marks that are less acknowledged. Take Ada Wells from New Zealand, for example. A fervent feminist, she lobbied extensively for the educational and economic rights of women, alongside her work for suffrage. New Zealand became the first self-governing country where women gained the right to vote in parliamentary elections in 1893. In Japan, suffragist Kamako Kimura was a tour de force. An actress by profession, Kimura used her platform to propagate women's rights. Though her efforts didn't bear fruit immediately, they sowed the seeds for future reforms in Japan. In the United States, Mabel Pinghua Lee, a Chinese immigrant, was instrumental in New York's suffrage activities. However, even after the 19th Amendment was passed, she could not vote because Chinese immigrants were denied citizenship until 1943. Let's not forget indigenous women like Sitkalasa, who advocated for the suffrage rights of Native Americans. The fight for suffrage within marginalized communities involved navigating multiple layers of disenfranchisement. In Muslim-majority countries like Egypt, women like Huda Sha'arawi founded feminist organizations and broke social barriers, setting the stage for women's enfranchisement in the mid-20th century. Many suffragists were prolific writers, journalists, and speakers. They wrote extensively, advocating not only for voting rights but also for broader gender equality, tackling issues like reproductive rights, education, and employment discrimination. No movement is without its critics, and women's suffrage had its fair share. Unpopular opinions and conspiracy theories often painted suffragists as homewreckers and anarchists, intent on overturning the social order. During periods like the Red Scare in America, the suffrage movement was often falsely linked to radical communism. These theories were largely aimed at discrediting the movement and were not grounded in factual analysis. Modern criticisms often point to the movement's lack of intersectionality. Many suffrage organizations, especially in the U.S., prioritized white women's voting rights over those of women of color. It's an uncomfortable fact but one that's crucial for a comprehensive understanding of the movement's complexities. The suffrage movement didn't end with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in the U.S. or with women gaining the right to vote in various parts of the world. Its spirit continues to animate modern struggles for gender equality. Today, we see its legacy in movements like #MeToo, women's marches, and in pushes for equal pay and reproductive rights. Each of these movements owes a debt to the suffragists who took the first steps toward gender equality. The presence of women in global politics is a testament to the long-lasting impact of the suffrage movement. From Angela Merkel in Germany to Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand to Kamala Harris in the United States, women are assuming roles once thought impossible. However, the fight is far from over. Even today, women are underrepresented in political positions. Discriminatory practices and social norms continue to challenge women's full participation in the democratic process. The women's suffrage movement was more than a campaign for voting rights. It was a revolutionary push for gender equality that reverberates to this day. Though flawed and complicated, its legacy is an essential part of the social fabric that shapes our current understanding of rights and equality. Thank you for joining us on this comprehensive journey through the women's suffrage movement. We invite you to tune in to the next episode of Chronicles, where we will delve into another seminal moment that has shaped the world we live in today.